Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're really digging into something that's both pretty compelling and honestly a bit unsettling. It's this thought. What if ancient prophecies about the future are actually playing out right now in global events, maybe in ways we haven't quite connected? So the big question for this deep dive is this. How might governments around the world eventually sort of unite to suppress religion? And maybe more interestingly, what could be the unexpected sparks that ignite such a huge shift? Now, this whole deep dive was actually sparked by one of our listeners, incredibly insightful. They brought up this fascinating theory, and it's rooted in Revelation 17:20. That verse talks about God putting a one thought into the hearts of rulers to carry out his will, until his words are accomplished. And our listener's specific idea that Islam, maybe surprisingly, could be the main catalyst pushing governments worldwide to eventually dismantle all traditional religious systems. So our mission today is to really unpack this theory. We'll use the sources you've shared with us. We're going to explore modern geopolitical trends, ideological ones, social currents, see what might align with this interpretation, or maybe what complicates it. It's definitely complex, but really relevant for today.
Absolutely. And as we navigate this, it's so important to remember we're looking at plausible alignments here. We're not making definitive predictions. The goal is more to explore these potential echoes, to really stress the importance of discernment in a world just flooded with information. So as we go through this, think about what really stands out to you.
Okay, great point. Let's start with that core idea then, from Revelation 17:1. What does it actually mean for God to, put it into their hearts for human rulers to carry out his thought, it sounds like?
Well, it seems to imply that even human actions, driven by their own reasons, right, their own self-interest, they can ultimately serve some larger divine plan,
right,
even if they're not consciously aware of it. It's this fascinating paradox, isn't it, between free will and divine sovereignty. Rulers might genuinely believe they're acting for stability or security, maybe even just for power. Yet their decisions, almost without them realizing, could line up with a preordained path. It's maybe less about, direct puppeteering and more about how all these seemingly independent actions weave together into a bigger design. It really adds a critical layer to how we understand events, past and present.
That is profound. So if that's the case, what does this convergence mean for the beast system we read about in Revelation chapters 13-17? Historically, I think many of us have seen that primarily as political tyranny, like straightforward oppression. But this theory we're looking at, it suggests it could be more, maybe the active suppression of organized faith itself, and perhaps replaced by a kind of worship of human power.
Worship of human power. If we connect that to the bigger picture, it doesn't necessarily mean literal religious rituals in the old sense. It could show up as absolute faith and technocracy, right? Where technology becomes the ultimate fix for everything. Or maybe a really fervent nationalism, where the state itself is supreme above all else. So the question becomes, could these modern ideologies effectively function like secular religions, demanding total allegiance, pushing traditional faith aside, but without needing actual altars or hymns?
Right. And you might be sitting there wondering, well, are governments actually restricting religion more now? Or is this just theoretical? Our sources point to some pretty compelling data from the Pew Research Center. Shows a really clear global trend.
Yes, the data is quite stark, actually. Back in 2021, the global median level of government restrictions on religious practices, it hit an all-time high, scored 3.0 on their 10-point index. That's the highest since they started tracking in 2007. So yeah, it suggests a pervasive tightening of control. It's happening worldwide.
And it's not just one or two things, is it? The methods are so varied. You see harassment of religious groups, interference in worship, outright bans on religious symbols like full-face veils in parts of Europe, censorship, even restrictions on halal or kosher food production. It touches everyday life.
Which brings up a really vital question. How does this tightening actually happen? Because it's often incremental. The Pew data specifically says restrictions have increased gradually over time since 2007. It's that boiling frog idea, isn't it? The slow erosion of freedom can go almost unnoticed. It just slowly shifts the baseline of what people accept as normal government interference. It doesn't always need a big dramatic announcement.
Yeah, that slow creep. Let's look at some examples from the sources that really show this. In China, we know about the systematic persecution of Uyghur Muslims and Christians too. Mass detention, forced labor. It's severe. In Iran, they've criminalized proselytizing if it conflicts with Islam. That makes minorities really vulnerable. And even in parts of Europe, you see new laws making it easier for authorities to shut down mosques. These are concrete examples.
And what's compelling, maybe even disturbing, is how effective these authoritarian models can seem purely from the state's viewpoint. The perceived success of these tactics, often dressed up as necessary for national security or unity, that could set a dangerous precedent. It suggests that these repressive strategies could spread. You could see a sort of global anti-religious unity emerge, not just by force, but by imitation. Other countries adopting what they see as best practices for control.
Okay, so that brings us back to our listener's specific point about Islam as a potential catalyst. Since 9/11, how has the response to Islamist extremism shaped how governments treat religion more broadly? Not just Islam, but all religion.
Well, the sources definitely show that after 9/11, the fear of religiously motivated violence just skyrocketed. And that led to much more surveillance, more profiling, especially, though not exclusively, of Muslims. In some places, this fed into what's described as an Islamophobic narrative, portraying Muslims generally as a threat to national values.
And we also saw things like the anti-Sharia movements pop up, right?
Right.
Pushing for state-level bans on Islamic law, often based on what the sources call a false fear that Sharia was somehow going to replace national legal systems.
Exactly. And the key insight here, I think, is how that security justification becomes this kind of universal template for controlling religion. It might start focused on one group, but the mechanism itself, using security fears to limit religious freedom, it's powerful, it's adaptable. So if Islamist extremism keeps being seen as a major global threat, that same framework could easily be turned onto other groups. Any group deemed divisive or dangerous, even if they have zero connection to terrorism. This adaptable tool could certainly speed up the conditions for that one-thought mentality among governments.
Okay, so security concerns can become a pretext. We see that.
Yeah.
But what about secularism itself? It's supposed to protect religious freedom by separating church and state, right? Keep things neutral. But our sources talk about it having a dual edge. How can something designed to protect freedom end up becoming a tool for suppression?
Yeah, that really makes you wonder, doesn't it? When secularism isn't just used to separate, but to actively enforce a kind of one thought, maybe the dominant societal view, or when it's used to subdue religions that are seen as challenging society's norms, that's when it fundamentally shifts. It stops being about protecting freedom from religion interfering with the state and starts limiting freedom of religion itself. Things like banning headscarves in Europe, often argued under neutrality, they really show this shift in practice.
Right. Moving beyond security, then, our sources also flag other really powerful ideological forces, things that could feed into this worship of human power, like woke ideology. Some analyses we looked at actually describe it as a secular religion. What does that even mean, and how does it challenge traditional faith?
Well, it's described in some sources as a complete system of thought and action with features that are surprisingly similar to maybe 17th century Protestantism, things like confession of sins, public shaming, having sacred values. So the suggestion is it's not just politics, it's a competing framework for morality and truth. And it often directly clashes with traditional religious teachings, especially on fundamental things like gender, sexuality, marriage. It presents a whole alternative belief system.
Okay, so if that's the case, what does it mean for religious liberty? Our sources mention government bodies pushing to actually repeal religious liberty protections, say, for faith-based charities or schools. There are attempts mentioned to compel Christians, for example, to affirm views described in the sources as radical transgender ideology. And we've apparently seen a rise in actual hostility, even vandalism, against Christian churches.
Yeah, and if an ideology like this gains real dominance, especially backing from institutions, government, corporations, universities, it can actively marginalize traditional religious views. It can even penalize expressions that don't conform. And that can lead to a sort of de facto one-thought scenario, enforced maybe not by explicit law always, but by strong cultural, legal, and governmental pressure. Adherence to the new orthodoxy becomes key.
Okay, now this next one. This really feels like it ramps things up. Transhumanism. It sounds like science fiction to some, maybe, but its goal is basically to overcome human limits using science and tech, even radical life extension. How does this fit into the picture of anti-religious feeling?
Get this, the Transhumanist Bill of Rights, Article 2 specifically, it says, and this is pretty direct, under penalty of law, no cultural, ethnic, or religious perspectives influencing government policy can impede life extension science. That's a really profound statement, isn't it? It signals a direct intention to just override religious objections using the force of law. It explicitly elevates human scientific progress to the supreme value, placing it above traditional ethics or morals derived from faith.
Wow. And that connects so directly back to that phrase we discussed earlier, the worship of human power.
Precisely. It clearly suggests that government policies built on transhumanist ideas could easily marginalize religious practices or beliefs seen as getting in the way of these advancements. It essentially displaces traditional religious frameworks, putting a new human-centric ultimate authority in their place.
Okay, one more thread here from the sources. The New World Order narrative. Now, this often lives in the conspiracy theory realm, we know that. But how does this narrative, even if it's just a fear, shed light on anxieties about global governance maybe influencing or suppressing religion?
Well, what's striking is how legitimate global cooperation gets tangled up with these conspiracy fears. You have international bodies promoting human rights, stability, cooperation, things most people would agree are good. But some people see this as a hidden move towards a totalitarian world government, one that's maybe inherently anti-Christian, using secular philosophies to undermine faith. Now, this can create widespread distrust of any global institution, even the ones genuinely working on human rights. And here's the critical question this raises. Could that very distrust ironically end up empowering, say, authoritarian, ultranationalist demagogues, leaders who might themselves suppress religious freedom but do it in the name of national sovereignty? It's a complex dynamic.
It really is. Okay, so we've talked a lot about forces that might suppress religion. But what about the other side? International efforts actually meant to protect religious freedom. Our sources mention things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the U.S. International Religious Freedom Act.
Yes, and those frameworks absolutely do guarantee freedom of religion. On paper, they're very strong. However, there's always a however, isn't there? There's a crucial caveat built right in. Limitations on religious freedom are allowed if they are, quote, necessary to protect public safety, order, health, or morals, or the fundamental rights and freedoms of others. That public safety clause, it can effectively function as a legal loophole, a mechanism for state-sanctioned religious control, letting states justify suppression using various excuses, like counterterrorism laws, even within frameworks designed to protect rights.
That seems like a pretty significant built-in vulnerability. So thinking about that, what does it mean for the role of big international organizations like the World Economic Forum? They actively engage with faith groups. Is that genuine partnership? Or could it be a more subtle kind of erosion of independent religious influence?
Right, that's the question it leads to, isn't it? If religious principles are mainly valued only when they line up with and support pre-existing secular global goals, then maybe that engagement subtly chips away at the independent moral voice of religious institutions. It could be a very sophisticated form of control where religious influence gets channeled, maybe diluted, maybe ultimately neutralized, rather than being overtly crushed.
And what about the whole idea of religious autonomy? You know, the principle that religious institutions have their own distinct sphere of authority separate from the state. Our sources suggest that very principle is being challenged more and more.
Yeah, the erosion of what's sometimes called sphere sovereignty, that's a really critical point from the sources. If that distinct realm of authority for religious institutions is increasingly challenged or diluted or just ignored, it basically paves the way for more state intrusion or global governance intrusion. It undermines the very foundation of religious freedom and could definitely lead towards more centralized control over things that used to be seen as internal, independent matters for faith communities.
Okay, so this deep dive, it really has laid out a pretty sobering possibility, hasn't it? That global governments might somehow converge towards suppressing religion, with Islamist extremism potentially being a key catalyst, as our listener suggested. But we've also seen how other powerful forces like wokeism, as described in the sources, or transhumanism, could also push things in that direction, towards a worship of human power. The data shows global restrictions are rising, and even well-meaning secular efforts or global governance initiatives might unintentionally feed into this one-thought mentality.
And connecting it all back, what's really striking is the potential synergy, how these seemingly separate forces could work together. The fear from extremism, the state's use of that adaptable security excuse, the enforcement of new ideological norms, even historical examples of state control during crises. They could all combine to create a kind of perfect storm. A combination that could seriously erode religious freedom and really push humanity towards favoring a single human-centric authority.
So what does all this mean for you, listening right now?
Our sources remind us, prophecy is often much clearer looking back. Hindsight is 20/20. But the trends we've talked about today, they certainly seem to resonate with a world system that could be moving towards demanding total allegiance to human power in one form or another.
Which really makes us ponder, doesn't it? In a world where so many different forces seem to be challenging traditional religious authority, traditional religious expression, what specific things can you do? in your own daily life, to uphold and maybe demonstrate your core beliefs, regardless of the pressures around you. The sources consistently bring up watchfulness and faithfulness.
Definitely something to mull on. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive.